Welcome back to the Ruy Lopez Masterclass. During the course of the previous 7 videos, we have looked at all of the sidelines that black could possibly throw at you. This includes the Steinitz, the deferred Steinitz, the classical, the Kozio, the Smyslov, the Schliemann Gambit, Knight d4, the birds. Now together, these lines probably cover 95% of the sidelines that your opponent can throw at you, and this means that we can comfortably now start focusing on the main lines. Now, I do kind of a deeper explanation of what I consider the main lines versus the sidelines in the introduction video, because I'm actually avoiding all of the main theory in the Ruy Lopez while still giving you a very easy repertoire to play, and you still get extremely typical Ruy Lopez mainline positions with the same pawn breaks, the same piece maneuvers, the same general ideas, so you get all the benefits of playing the Ruy Lopez, which I think develops you as a player tremendously without having to know so much preparatory theory in advance. So I talk about sort of this philosophy a little bit more in the introduction video, but I'll also mention it a little bit here. Essentially, all of the sidelines, as you see on the screen, are moves where black avoids putting the knight on f6 immediately. All of the main lines are therefore the variations where black begins by playing knight to f6. Now this could be at this move, or it could be first playing a6 and then knight f6. Essentially, they can always throw in a6 and if they'd like also b5, but if they move the knight out to f6 specifically before making a decision about the bishop on f8, then these are the main lines. And more specifically, after they move the knight to f6, whenever they do this in the main lines, meaning they didn't move the bishop yet, I'm responding by playing d3, securing the center. This is known either as the anti-Berlin or the Anderson, depending on whether they play a6 first before playing knight f6. And now this is where the main line has its biggest split. They have to make a decision about the bishop. If they've already moved the knight to f6, we know we're in the main line, and here they're either moving the bishop to c5, or they're moving it a bit more solidly, but also a bit more passively to e7. Today's video focuses on them moving the bishop to c5, and whenever they put the bishop on c5 in the main lines, we're responding with c3. Okay, so this is hopefully making sense so far. Again, they can first throw in a6 and then move the knight out. Like I said, this is the main line. They haven't made a decision yet about the bishop, so we're playing d3. And if they now move the bishop out, we're playing c3. If they start by playing b5, that's okay. It doesn't change anything. Now they move the bishop out to c5, and again, we're playing c3. So essentially, these are the main lines in this video where they first move the knight, then the bishop to c5, and they can throw in a6 and b5 at their leisure, and against the knight move, we respond with d3, and against the bishop move, whenever they make it, we respond with c3. And with this basic formula, you are essentially guaranteeing yourself a typical Ruy Lopez structure with typical Ruy Lopez plans. So the way that I'm going to present this variation in the video today, I have a lot of game examples, and there's also some different branching points of theory, but honestly, there's so many move orders in these lines for black, meaning they can play a6 and then b5, or they can omit playing a6 and b5 altogether and play for, after the bishop comes to c5, they can play for d6, bishop d7, they can castle, they can make a decision about the queen, in certain cases they strike with d5. So essentially there's so many different move orders for black in these structures that not even the top grandmasters have memorized all the different move orders. Instead, it's largely based on the feel for the position and understanding the basic ideas. And so what I'm actually going to do is start by talking about precisely those ideas. So let's put one of the main lines on the position. Let's say a6, bishop a4, knight f6, we're playing d3, bishop c5, we're playing c3, and I'm going to start by just talking to you about the plethora of ideas at white's disposal that you should always be looking to implement regardless of the different move orders that your opponent will play in this main line. So let's begin. Of course, our king is coming to the kingside. We're castling here. Then the rook from f1 is going to come to e1, centralizing it. This is the best square for the rook, and it also leaves the f1 square open so that the knight on b1, which unfortunately, the downside of c3, it cannot come to c3 itself, so it has this nice maneuver via d2 to the now newly opened f1 square to g3, and it comes to the king side where it works with the knight on f3 to secure many important squares on that side of the board, namely the light squares of f5 and h5. So to review, castles, rook e1, knight d2, knight f1, knight g3. If they ever play for b5, our bishop comes to c2, and our main pawn breakthroughs here are d4, striking in the center, and we try to always look for this, and we try to figure out if it's a good moment to do it, or if we want to make a bit more prophylaxis preparation moves in advance. And then also, especially if they played b5, a4 becomes a strong lever to engage in some queenside play. And in terms of where our play actually resides, indeed, we find ourselves a lot of time playing in the queenside. A lot of times the b5 pawn after we take becomes a key weakness. If we've already played d4, you can imagine the bishop and queen targeting that weak square. And a ton of times, you're also going to see kingside play. The knight on g3, with the light squares, especially if the bishop, for some reason, maybe it develops to b7, or maybe it's blocked. If it can't control these light squares, that is often a great sign for white to begin launching an attack, the queen often coming to f3. So this is a ton of ideas, and it might be overwhelming, but in the video today, through a series of many game examples, you're going to see all of these ideas, whether it be the early piece maneuvers that I mentioned of castling, rook e1, knight d2, knight f1, knight g3, bishop c2, or the pawn breakthroughs of d3 to d4 and a2 to a4, or playing on the queen side and the king side like I just said. You're going to see all of these ideas that are typical in the Ruy Lopez come to life in the video and in the example games. So unlike the sideline videos, where I think knowing the theory is not only feasible, but it's also very helpful, here it's completely impractical. Understand the ideas and understand when to apply different ideas, and you'll find yourselves very confidently playing these main lines. So that was a lot. So let's start jumping in to the actual variations. And what I will say is that I am going to look at all of the games that begin with knight f6, we're playing d3, and then bishop c5 immediately. Now, of course, black can always throw in a6 and b5. They could have done this before moving the bishop and the knight. It doesn't change much, because in a few moments you're going to see this transpose where they're going to play a6 and b5. So after c3, let's look at castles. Obviously a logical move. We're going to castle as well. And one extra point to mention is whenever they play d6, I like to restrict this bishop's scope. I like when the bishop is passively sitting on d7, and I don't really like when it pins our knight. So I think h3 as a response to d6 in a lot of these positions is something to consider. One thing I'll point out, you see all of the plans that I mentioned, and now I'm adding an extra prophylaxis move. We have the time to do this, and honestly, black does too. This is a largely maneuvering, slow positional game in these main lines. So h3, we'll look at two moves here. So like I said, a6 is possible at all of these junctions, and they can play a6 and b5 here. Let's begin with this. The bishop comfortably retreats to c2. I love the bishop here. It guards our center, preparing d4, and if the center ever opens up, you can imagine the bishop being an attacking piece as well. Now, bishop b7. Now, whenever you see bishop e7 in these lines, as opposed to bishop d7, what could this tell you? Well, okay, like I said, it abandons the light squares, and a lot of times the attacking possibilities become very viable on those light squares. So that is one observation I think is useful to note. But okay, we haven't finished our development, so rook e1, and we can start with these maneuvers, bringing the knight to f1 and bringing the knight to g3. So far, white is following my ideas to a T, and here, after knight to e7, we can engage in some aggressive intentions. These games that I'm about to show you in these lines are going to show why moving the bishop to b7 early on is often something that black has to do very carefully, and it makes a bit more sense to only do that if the bishop is still on e7 or f8, where you have a bit more defense of the king. When both bishops are on the queen side, the king can feel a little bit weak, especially if h6 was played, restricting the bishop to g5, but also creating a hook. So let's see. Knight to h4. Okay, the f5 square looks very juicy. The queen also has now a way to come in. The attack very much begins to form. We're going to look at a few moves here, because knight to e7 had a very specific purpose. A lot of times moving the knight away to play for c5 is the idea here, and then bringing the knight back where it sits nicely in the center, but with a bit more squares and space on the queen side. Now, what you just saw in the past couple of moves is white not playing for a4 and not playing for d4 like you're going to see in some of the other variations, but instead noticing the possibilities of attacking on the king side based on the weaknesses that black has made and taking that opportunity very seriously. So queen f3, and in this position, knight to f5. right? The knights are coming in, and after king to h7, trying to bring a bit more support to the dark squares here, there's already a tactical shot. And this is how quickly, if black does not play optimally, and if it doesn't play carefully with the king side, this is how quickly the position can explode. Knight takes g7. And after king takes g7, the other knight comes to f5, and the position totally opens up. The knight now takes on h6, the king is fully exposed, f7 is a weak point, the queen can come in, the light squares are weak, the bishop now will come in. Often 3 pieces is enough for the attack. Here, white has even a 4th, and the king is so exposed. This seems pretty good. So queen to e7, bishop g5, pinning the knight. The bishop has to retreat back to d8 to defend, but now simply knight to g4, taking advantage of the pin, and after queen e6, we win back the piece. The rook tries to come in for the defense, but it's not going to be enough. The rook is sliding in via e3. One of the other benefits of coming to e1, the rook has more potential and it's a bit more active. And in this position, a really nice move from white. I think this is super instructive. The queen and the rook are kind of trampling each other, looking for the same squares. The rook wants to slide in, and the queen doesn't have great infiltration points. So queen to d1, letting the rook slide in, which you'll see soon, but also staying flexible and never forgetting about one of the key ideas I mentioned, d4, which has the potential to open up the bishop aiming at the king. You see the holistic nature of the Ruy Lopez. We are never fixating just on the kingside attack, but we are letting all of our pieces play together. d4 here. Now, this is a really instructive game. The rook comes trying to activate d5, blocking the center, and this also means that because the center is now blocked and closed, the kingside attack also becomes a bit stronger, right? This is a key positional concept. The queen now eyeing h6, the rook can soon come to g3. And yeah, I mean, black obviously has some defensive chances, it's never over, but white is clearly in the driver's seat, and between having to defend and having to attack, I think many would prefer having to attack, and it's a much easier job. The knight now remaneuvers to the weak f5 square, which again is all a point of the funny bishop sitting on b7, a little bit out of the game, especially because of d4, d5. It has absolutely no purpose, and it's a very funny piece. The knight comes to f5, the queen trying to defend over the dark squares, a4. And again, this is why I love this example so much. We combine kingside play with the center strike and the a4 strike that I mentioned taking control of the queen side. So again, never forget about other options at your disposal, and this brings just another avenue towards the attack. The rook now comes to a7. Yeah, I really like this game example. The queen comes in, taking control of another avenue of attack, which is this a file. And here, a really interesting decision. Queen to a5, trading queens, which seems counterintuitive because you were attacking, you wanted to push for more, but the truth is this endgame is purely miserable. The knight is probably the strongest piece on the board, d6 is undefendable, b5 is also super weak. The rook is so much better than the counterpart, and for example, bishop c8 may be best, but the engine, and I think any human certainly agrees that knight takes d6, white is simply winning. They are up, I believe, 3 pawns. All of their pieces are better than their counterparts. The pawn on b5 is super weak. And again, I mean, this is an incredible example for so many reasons, and if you had to stop watching at any point in the video, if you could only watch one game example, then take this one in, because it shows the pure flexibility of the Ruy Lopez, okay? You have this massive kingside attack, but we are not fixated on that, right? We use tactics on the kingside in the c5 line, in the c5 game. We use tactics on the kingside to blast open the position. We end up regaining the piece, not focusing only on checkmate, which doesn't exist. We bring in our pieces very flexibly, but we also remember our other plans, which are very strong. d4 here, locking up the center, and then a4, opening up the queen side, is arguably the 2 moves that ended up actually allowing white to convert, because it was indeed this a file that enabled the trade into the endgame, which was totally winning. So that's another layer of flexibility, not focusing on keeping queens on and trying to kill your opponent, but being able to recognize and transforming into a winning endgame. A beautiful example of how all of the ideas that I talked about in the first segment really come to life. So I really like this one. And now we have many examples to follow that probably can't live up to that hype, but I think are nonetheless super instructive. So if you have a bit more time, you can pause the video here and take this as the main chunk of the video, but there are many, many more games that I'm just going to kind of go through a little bit more quickly because I think they have a lot of instructive value. One thing I'll mention here, c5 is the move we looked at, where after queen f3 the attack began to play itself. Knight g6 is possible to try to trade pieces, but after knight takes g6, d4 comes, right? Remaining flexible. It's true that the kingside attack seems a little bit less possible now, but the center becomes very much in white's disposal, and d4 and a4, kind of like what we just saw, is a really strong combination here. The bishop comes to e3, we can lock up the center. A lot of times locking up the center is strong, especially if f5 is never coming, because the kingside is going to be endlessly weak, and black's not going to generate the counterplay that they so desperately need in the center of the board. So the rook comes to the f-file, we open up the a-file again, and this is a nice game because it shows you the pure dominance that can occur not in the kingside attack, but in the queenside attack. So like I mentioned, this b5 point often becomes a very weak area in black's attack, in black's position rather, and white can attack it. So queen to e2, bishop d3, I think is a really instructive point here, and it invokes c4, but after bishop takes b6, pawn takes d3, queen takes d3, white is simply much better here, okay? Because the entire position opens up, white won a pawn in the process, the b5 pawn is still weak, this bishop is pretty good, especially compared to black's bishop. White is doing very much good here. So that was one variation that I think was good to show. Again, the power of d4 and a4, and the power of the weaknesses on the queen side. Another line to kind of show is queen d7 here. And this is another one where the attack really comes. Now, I will say that d4 is possible here, and a lot of times you have many good moves, right? You can go for this d4, a4 plan to really take control of the center, and this is totally fine. A lot of times it will end up leading anyways to an attack on the king side nonetheless, but in this position you can start with that attack a bit more directly. Queen f3 here, and it's true that black, and you just saw the beautiful move, I shouldn't have spoiled it, it is true that black can strike in the center d5, this is often what they're going for, but a lot of times if you've already accumulated enough pieces, you can ignore the center, right? So d4 was a way to kind of respond to the center, which is fine, but queen to f3 is a way to recognize the power on the king side. Bishop takes h6, opening up the position. Taking here was not possible based on a very simple tactic, kind of surprising that black missed it, but this is what can happen when you have so many pieces, so many threats. The bishop now comes back to g5, the knight comes to f5, again this juicy square on f5, and again we're never forgetting about the center. Taking here was a nice intermezzo, queen to h5, the knight comes to h6, but after knight takes h6 and rook takes e5, distracting the queen so that h6 can be taken. That would have been very miserable. So instead, the queen comes to d6, but now we keep on distracting the queen. And again, if you ever take it, then queen takes h6 and bishop f6 was the idea, where mate on g7 becomes unstoppable. So another, I think, super motivating and inspiring attacking game that really motivates you to start playing these lines. So that is it, guys, from this section of the video. So this was, again, when they go for this early a6 and then b5. I do want to end the video by talking about perhaps a slightly rare option, but still something that I would feel bad if I didn't mention, because your opponent can throw at you and it certainly has a point. And it's this move knight e7. And the point is to largely omit or at least delay a6 and b5 and instead focus on a different break, which is c6 and then d5. And this plan actually is very strong against the move rook e1, because now c6 comes, d5 is on the horizon, and black gets a lot of play in the center, and we haven't been quick enough to generate our counterplay with d4 and certainly not a4. And so instead, after knight e7, what I like to do is notice and take the opportunity that the knight has just retreated from the center post, and therefore we strike immediately. d4, right? We take this one tempo opportunity where if we give black the time, then they're totally fine, but we don't give them the time. So d4 is the point here. And after bishop e6, only now rook e1. And the insertion of d4 makes all the difference because c6 d5 becomes far less intimidating. It is probably still black's best plan here, but I think that white gets a pretty good play. So we'll look at this in a moment. I'll say that delaying d5 is really not advisable. d5 is the only way that black really chips away at the center, so I think sooner rather than later it's going to have to come. If they delay it, we can simply continue with our normal plan, and at some point they're going to play for this, right? Without playing for this, if they give us the time to develop our pieces, if they give us the center without playing for d5, if they surrender the center, then they're not really playing for anything. And I show this game here because it shows another way that you can try to play in these positions. Now, bishop g5, I think, is a pretty cool move here because you are encouraging f6, which opens up and greatly weakens the king, and you'll see how this comes into play very soon. We have a couple of trades of the rooks off the board, and then the knight begins to come in, and the bishop comes to g7, and f6 becomes a very weak point, and bishop g5 specifically made f6 that weak point. So I think this is a really cool example. The queen tries to come in along the dark squares, and it's really this bishop that is the best piece on the board, and if you take it, guess what? This knight becomes the best piece on the board. So black is unable to deal with their problems, the pawn on f4 falls, and even though black has the two bishops, the bishops aren't doing anything, right? With a closed center, which is very typical for the Ruy Lopez and something we often aim at achieving, the bishops don't have as much scope as they would desperately want. Now, it is true that black ended up getting very good play here, but the bishop ends up falling on e4. Okay, the endgame, like in a lot of my videos, is not the main point of concern, although this endgame is actually really fascinating, and I'll just play it out for you. Suffice to say that the extra pawn for white here ends up winning the game. The knight is very much capable of stopping the two pawns on the queen side. So that was one game. I think, if you take anything from that game, it can be kind of this move e5 here, not fearing this transformation of the position. And also the move bishop takes g6, which I didn't really take note of, but it's a very interesting decision. I'm not sure if I would intuitively want to trade away my bishop. It's arguably the strongest piece, but the point is that the bishop ends up on g5, ends up then taking that place of the strongest piece, largely because of f6, and the weakness is created on the king side. And this bishop on the dark squares becomes very menacing and difficult for black to deal with. Okay, so that was one game. Let's go back into probably the main move here, which is not knight g6, but like I said, they have to strike with d5 earlier rather than later. And in this position, bishop takes e4 is possible. The engine doesn't hate it, but I don't like giving away our bishop, even for the cost of a pawn. In that previous position, you had a very concrete reason to give away the bishop. The dark squares became very vulnerable. Here, there isn't that concrete reason, and I don't like this transformation. I much prefer knight d2, and even if we're not winning a pawn, we're getting our pieces into the game, and I'm only happy to trade away the bishop for its counterpart, where we're not going to be lacking some weak light squares later in the game. And on the contrary, I think that we have pretty good control over the dark squares again. Now, this position isn't, spectacular for white. I think white has a comfortable edge, certainly easier practical play, but black has done all of the right things. They have moved their pieces nicely. They have struck with c6 and d5. They haven't made any significant errors, so there isn't anything too wrong with this position for them either. It's a normal Ruy Lopez position, probably not as typical as the ones you saw earlier in the video, because this 97 idea is not all that common, but nonetheless, I think this is a comfortable stopping point for the opening segment. I think we have developed our pieces certainly with a purpose. All of our pieces, I think, are very strong and on their probably best placed squares. And I'm comfortable ending the variation here. I think white has achieved something out of the opening. Now I'm going to end the video by doing a summary of all of the ideas that are available for you with the white pieces in these main lines. This is much like what I did in the beginning of the video where I talked about the main ideas at your disposal, but I think that after you looked at all of those game examples and you saw all of those ideas in action, it's worth to revisit these ideas from a theoretical standpoint once again and just kind of list them and go through them very quickly, because I think that will really cement them into your minds. So let's begin. We're talking here, of course, of knight f6, the main lines. We're playing d3, and if they play bishop c5, we play c3. If they ever play a6, they can also play b5. That's okay. We play bishop a4 and then bishop c2. And these are the main ideas at our disposal from the white side. We are castling, of course. We are bringing the rook to e1, enabling this knight maneuver via the f1 square to g3. If they move the d pawn, we are happy to play h3, stopping the bishop from coming to g4, and therefore forcing the bishop into passivity. And in fact, if that bishop comes to the other diagonal, you saw the light square holes that leaves on the king side. This takes us to now the main pawn breakthroughs. Obviously, if the bishop ever comes to c2, I like it very much here. I think it's a very strong piece. And in terms of pawn breakthroughs, d4 is definitely the one that you should be looking for. And a4 is the other one, especially if they've played a6 and b5. It's a great way to break through on the queen side. And because we have pieces all across the board and we have more space on all sides of the board, we're able to attack on both sides of the board. As you saw, we have very concrete ideas and threats on the king side involving a knight coming to f5, a queen coming to f3, a rook lifting up to that side of the board, a bishop coming to g5 or h6, but we also very much reserve the right to play on the queen side via a4 taking on b5 and this nice battery we can set up with queen to e2 and bishop d3 aiming towards that side of the board. If we open up the a file in a moment where we can control that a file, that can be very advantageous. And again, d4 often than d5 is a great way to take control of the center, gain more space, close up the center, and be able to continue with our ideas on the queen side and the king side. So it is a mouthful. There is so much energy, so much play on the board available for you in the Ruy Lopez. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. As always, there's a PGN file that you can access and you can review the games that we looked at today and you can revisit some of the ideas. I'd also recommend just start playing these lines and you're going to see these ideas coming to life in your own games and you're going to slowly improve and recognize when to go for the kingside attack, when to go for this d4 break, when to go for a4, and so on. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I know it was a lot, but I think it was a good way to get you going with these main lines. Subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.